Well, I'm delighted to have Derek Rae on the score, our first special guest of our new footballing season, and an expert, a man whose voice certainly everyone will be familiar with. But it's lovely to be looking at you, Derek, and to be talking to you today. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for the invitation, Michael. Looking forward to it.
Now, I want to start with the Bundesliga because it's almost back and it's just about finished. An incredible turnaround, but so many people had really never seen it before in the UK, and through strange circumstances in lockdown had the opportunity to. And I think it's fair to say a lot of us were immediately in love with it.
Yeah, that's certainly the feedback I got from a lot of people around the world because, as you know, the Bundesliga is a big part of my life. It has been for a long time and certainly professionally in the last few years. And because the Bundesliga came back before any other big European league, there certainly was an opportunity there for people who, were aware of the Bundesliga but hadn't properly got into it to become more knowledgeable and to actually watch it. Now, the great shame, of course, is that we talk a lot in Germany about football as it's meant to be. The big selling point of the Bundesliga, of course, these full stadia, the largest crowds in any league anywhere in the world. And that's not something that could be showcased or can be showcased in the near term anyway. But I think people saw for themselves that the football is very compelling. The style of play is attractive. It's not just about Bayern, even though they won the title again and are favourites to do so one more time with regard to the coming season, won the Champions League, won the German Cup as well. But I think people saw that it is multifaceted and there's a lot to like about Germany's top flight.
I mean, even in the way that some German club supporters protested the Geisterspiel scenario was remarkable, with sofas daubed with motifs and all sorts of things. You get a flavour of how important that football is in the culture of the country, and just how passionate the fan base is.
That's absolutely right. And I think it's the one thing that does attract people. I talk to a lot of people from Northern Ireland, from Scotland, from England, from Wales, who regularly make the trip to Germany to watch football. In fact, some have told me that they began doing this a few years ago and now just can't stop, and now find that it is the focal point of their own footballing supporting lives. And the fan culture is interesting because, again, it's different according to what you want it to be. You have ultras who sometimes are political, who make their points about social issues. It's about that as much as it is about the football. Often there are ties with ultras of other clubs, and sometimes that can override everything else. There are other people who don't want to be so much part of the ultra culture, who just want to go to the game feeling that they are part of something bigger. And I think it's true to say that whatever your preference is, whatever form of fandom you want to get behind, it is a good deal less corporate than it is, for example, in the Premier League in England. I think if you use that as your measuring stick and then you go to Germany to watch football as a fan, you realise that the old, to use the phrase that Roy Keane used a few years ago, the old prawn sandwich brigade is not really to be found in Germany to the same extent. So I think that's the one thing that does open minds. And I always say, once it becomes part of you, German football, it doesn't leave you.
And I think maybe that's something that has ingratiated itself with fans of, the Irish League, for example, because we
Yep.
feel so close to our players and managers quite often because we are in real life, when, in their, maybe their other forms of work or whatever it might be. And you see a league which seems to really focus on its fans, like the Bundesliga, and that wins a lot of people over very quickly.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think maybe coming from a place like Northern Ireland, obviously I'm from Scotland. I used to work very closely with Stephen Craigan, former captain of Northern Ireland, and he and I would talk a lot about the culture of fans in different countries. And I think in places like Northern Ireland and Scotland, it is an honest to goodness sport. You don't get into football because you're trying to be high and mighty, or you're trying to sort of ascend in society or anything like that. And the idea of corporate culture in our countries is not really there when it comes to football so much. Now, in England, I think it is different. And I think in England, it has, moved to a different phase with regard to that corporate culture. And I'm not saying it doesn't exist at all in Germany, but you're hard pressed to find it when you go to a game. And again, we can't talk about this during a pandemic, but in non-pandemic times, one of the great things about German football is the trip to the game and the departure from the game. You sort of lose yourself as part of the collective as people, travel by underground or by bus or by train with all the other fans, and you sort of make a big day out of it. And interestingly, away fans travel with the home fans. There's rarely trouble. I don't often see trouble. Maybe at a big derby like Dortmund against Schalke, that there might be an edge. That's the biggest derby in Germany. But in most cases, you will see away fans, squeezing in with home fans on crowded underground trains or buses. And there's a bit of back and forth, but there's never trouble, at least not in my experience.
And isn't that wonderful? If only we could tap into that a little bit more and understand it, because it's a very different experience maybe for some listening today who are used to traveling to England to watch their football.
Yeah, and I think when you get into that a bit more, Michael, I think the one thing that you realize when you talk to German fans is that they see themselves as having, in many respects, more in common with each other, fans of different teams, than sometimes with authority. So sometimes the big argument is against decisions that are made, whether it's by politicians, whether it's by the league authorities themselves. Now, I'm not going to say that the league authorities are right or wrong. There are two sides to every argument. But it just comes down to the fact that in England, for example, what I see is that, fans just sort of decide that they're going to hate their rival fans. That's sort of where the argument is carried out. It's like, well, you're not fans of our club, so we detest you and you detest us. There's not this sort of mutual loathing in Germany to the same extent. I mean, granted, there are some teams, some fans who simply don't gel with other fans. That goes without saying. But often there's a bigger picture. And it's only when you sort of understand that and get into the culture of German football in that sense that I think you really sort of move to the next level of saying, okay, now I am a real Bundesliga fan. Now I'm sort of getting this much more. And it's like anything else. The more you learn, the more you want to learn.
I find your videos fantastic in the garden, which looks like a wonderful garden, might I add.
Thank you.
Really put mine to shame. I don't know if you maintain that yourself, Derek, but it's a top effort.
I can't take credit. My wife, Beth, is the gardener in the family. So she probably would like it if I were to say more when I do these back garden Bundesliga videos that I'm not the gardener, she is. So I've said it here.
There you go. Finally, you've got your moment and recognition. Was that something you just did kind of on the spur of the moment? Let's put a little video out and see how it goes, or what was the thinking? Because they took off.
Yeah, thank you for that. I honestly did it with no expectation of anything coming out of it. But it really came down to this. I work in Germany a lot. Even though I live here in the Boston area in the USA, I travel a lot as a commentator and most often to Germany. But obviously with the pandemic, beginning of March, I simply couldn't travel. It just wasn't on. And it was clear to me it wasn't going to be on for quite some time. Here we are several months later. I still haven't traveled. And that's unlikely in the near future. So I thought, well, I have been working on German football for a long time. It's been in my soul since I was a young boy in Aberdeen in Scotland, a German student at that time. So I thought, well, what can I do to try to, knowing that there would be new Bundesliga viewers out there, what could I do to try to spread that knowledge a little bit? I thought, well, okay, I have this Twitter platform. I have followers. Many are Bundesliga fans, but some are not. And so I thought, how about just doing something on an ad hoc basis, going into the garden, which I do very much enjoy and haven't had the chance to really, show off, if you like, in these last few years, because I'm normally traveling, going to tournaments during the summer. But I thought with a nice background, why don't we try to just educate people a little bit and provide some knowledge with regard to German football, its teams and its stories. And it's the one thing I always feel that people maybe don't explore enough. English football has this sort of romanticism attached to it. And I'm not saying that that's not right, because there are some wonderfully romantic stories in English football. But I know, living here in the USA, there's sort of a feeling that English football alone has these romantic stories. Now, you could tell me a lot of the romantic stories about football in Northern Ireland. I could do likewise in Scotland. We know that romance and football go hand in hand the world over. Stories and football are there wherever you want to look for them. And that is absolutely true of Germany. But one of the things I've realized for a long time, being a German linguist, being somebody who speaks fluent German and often, just spends hours reading and thinking in German when it comes to football, that the stories hadn't necessarily been told in full to an English language audience. So I thought, well, here's a chance to do something creative, see where it goes. And I had great fun doing them. And, if it brought a bit of knowledge to people who were looking for that when the Bundesliga came back before all the other major leagues, then I'm delighted.
Well, it really did that. It shone a light on clubs that definitely do not get the coverage here. We're used to seeing Bayern Munich, obviously, in European action, and then whoever else might qualify in any given season from Germany. And even then, you could argue sometimes the portrayal of the clubs is a bit two-dimensional. You'll be pointed towards their best players and maybe a goal stat, but you don't get the feel of the club, its history, or the area in which they play.
Yeah, and that is something I did want to put across, because, if you were to ask me to sort of sum up each Bundesliga or second division, Zweite Bundesliga team, I would give you a paragraph on each of them that would talk about culture, it would talk about region, it would talk about footballing achievements, it would talk about what they're known for, what they might not want to be known for, maybe some socio-political things as well, because that's all part of it too in Germany. And every club has that story. But I think if you just look at it, one-dimensionally, you would say, yeah, well, it's Bayern and they dominate, and, we know that. But, there's so much more to the story of German football and to the story of all those clubs. And, yeah, it was great to be able to have that little forum to spend some time on each of the clubs. And, sometimes it was serious, sometimes it was a bit more quirky, which was great fun as well. And, really hopefully taking in the full sort of gamut of emotions, so to speak, when it comes to clubs in Germany.
And I think by the end of it, broadcasters learned it was Zweite Bundesliga and not Bundesliga Zwei. That was a pet of mine, Derek.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Yeah, the Zweite Bundesliga, the second division. I realize that it's easier for a lot of people just to call it, Bundesliga 2. But, we talk about Serie A. We don't sort of change that. We talk about Ligue 1. We don't talk about one league. So, I think we should be true to the nomenclature and call it the Zweite Bundesliga.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's become an interesting conversation among commentators, and I'm sure supporters have weighed in on it now in terms of the anglicizing of names maybe being a norm at one stage versus now trying to be a bit more authentic with pronunciation.
Well, that's a subject that's dear to my heart. I think with commentators, I think we all do things our own way while trying to set high standards. And I would agree with you. I think in the Anglo world, I think for the last few decades, the default position has often been to anglicize names. Now, I think as the world of football becomes more multicultural and more international, and I think as more people are exposed to languages and travel and things like that, I think it stands to reason that people maybe are heading in a different direction. I probably would say, and I fully admit this, I maybe take it to an extreme as somebody with a languages background, but it really comes down to this, Michael. I've always felt that as somebody who has studied languages, if I can say a name authentically, then I should do that. Why should we dumb anything down? Why should we say, well, because somebody else might not be able to make those sounds, then we shouldn't either. I don't really buy that. I think you play to your strengths as a commentator. And, there'll be some things that other commentators can do much better than I. But when it comes to languages, that's an area of experience and, something that I certainly find is close to my heart. But I do think it comes down to accuracy. And I've always said, if I were a written journalist, it would be, unthinkable for me to misspell a player's name, to just say, well, I'm just going to write it down any old way and people will understand. You know, if there's one letter that's wrong, people will still get it. That's okay. Well, no, that wouldn't be okay. So I feel the same way about pronunciations. Now, you know, with the caveat that we're probably not always going to get it 100% right, but my goodness, we should try. You know, that should be the starting position, to go in and say, yeah, I as a matter of respect, I want to get this player's name correct. And it summed it up for me one night when I was working in Scotland with BT Sports a few years ago. And there was a player at the time who played for Dundee United. He had actually just joined Dundee United, but he had played in England before, and he played in Scotland prior to that as well. And I had a good idea what his name actually was, but I had heard it pronounced a different way by just about every other broadcaster. And so I had a chat with him, as I was prone to do before matches. And I said to introduce myself, and I said, I'm doing the game for BT Sport. I said, could you just pronounce your name for me as you would say it and as your family would say it? And he said, Farid El Alaghi. El Alaghi, French, Moroccan. And I had heard him pronounced by other broadcasters El Alagoui. Mm-hmm. He said, yeah, he sort of chuckled. He said, yeah, that's what I've heard people say. He said, but it is El Alaghi. I said, well, I'm going to call you that on air tonight. I said, I was actually planning to call you that anyway, because I suspected that was how you pronounced it. I said, but now that we've bumped into each other, I'm glad that you can confirm that. So I said it on the air, thought nothing of it. And then a few weeks later, I bumped into him again doing a Dundee United game. And he said, thank you very much. He said, my family watched the broadcast. He goes, it was so nice to hear our name said properly. Now, this can actually get you into trouble as a commentator, because you go for authenticity and you keep the player happy and his family happy. But then you have people, you know, from general society saying, you're getting his name wrong. You're saying his name wrong. That's not what we call him. And I will say, well, it's not a matter of who are we to impose upon a player a pronunciation. It's up to the player and his family. And so that's what I always try to go by. And I do spend a tremendous amount of time researching that and making phone calls and listening to the player saying that his name himself, hopefully somewhere, calling people in other countries, contacts I have in other countries, if it's a language I don't speak myself. And, you know, I get criticism for it sometimes, because we are not always used to hearing the authentic pronunciation.
It reminds me immediately of Jagielka, Jagielka.
Yeah, that's right. Well, again, players don't, I'm not going to say Phil in this case didn't help anybody, but players sometimes, through saying things like, well, you can say it whatever way you like, that actually doesn't help, because then people will say it whatever way they like. And yeah, Jagielka is the, to best of my knowledge, is the preferred family pronunciation. But yeah, I think what I've seen in recent years is I've seen players come into British football, English football specifically, and I think sometimes their agents tell them, well, you know, you should anglicize your name a little bit because people won't say it properly. But I'm a great believer, just, you know, say it as you want to have it said, and everybody will do their best to comply with that. Yeah. But I think the difficulty is, and I know this happens, is that there's a decision made sometimes by broadcasters, we are going to call him this. I've even heard that conversation, what are we calling him? And whenever I've been involved in a conversation like that, I've always said, no, that's not the question. The question is not what are we calling him? The question is, what does he call himself?
Yeah, no, it's a perilous situation for commentators all over. Yeah, and you're right.
It is.
When you do your research into a match and all of a sudden, wow, which version of his name will I go with? And you don't always have that access. So it's interesting to know the level of detail, making phone calls. Is it true you phoned embassies, consulates?
I used to do that back in the early days here in the USA when we didn't have internet to the extent that we have now. And if I were, you know, doing say Saudi Arabia, I remember doing some of their national team games, you're thinking, well, where do you start with Saudi Arabia? You know, I didn't have easy access to, you know, somebody who was able to help me with their pronunciations. So I thought, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to call the embassy in Washington, D.C. So I did. And I found somebody there who was a football fan and was actually very keen to help me out and talk about football for quite some time. And so that was sort of my go-to for a little while. When I didn't know that particular language, I would call the embassy. Now, in recent years, it's a bit easier because you can go online now and you can often hear the player saying the name himself, or you can hear an interviewer from that country saying the name, and you can narrow it down that way. But yeah, I did it fairly recently again. I was back working in the UK doing a team from Ukraine. And again, it was fairly short notice. I didn't know that I was going to be doing the game. It was early rounds of Europe, and you know what happens. You know, draws are made, and you know, rights are picked up at the last minute. And on that occasion, I called the embassy in the UK, and again was helped greatly by a gentleman in the press office. So I think you always have to be creative. You have to be committed to it as well. There are some people who are not as committed to that. You know, they just think, well, you know, it's not the most important part of the job. So we all have strengths and weaknesses. We all have areas that we think are important. As I say, you could compare and contrast my work with other commentators, and there'll be other commentators who are stronger in certain areas than I am. But because of my languages background, I just think it's very important.
I know commentators often very modestly just say, well, we're just, you know, getting the names, and if we can get all the details right on the day, we've done our job. But the amount of preparation I know that goes into it is otherworldly at times. I mean, what if there was a norm-ish for how you prepare for a big Bundesliga game? How long would it take you in the days and weeks leading up to a match?
I often get asked that, and it's quite a difficult one to answer because the preparation isn't done sort of within a fixed period of time. What I would say to you is it probably cumulatively is several days, but it's a couple of hours here, and it's an hour there, and it's 4 hours, you know, the next day. It's really a matter of just scribbling. So what happens is, if I know that, say I'm doing Bayern against Borussia Dortmund, and say it's, you know, 5 weeks notice, you know, I'll probably start scribbling both teams, you know, fairly early on around that time. And when I say scribbling both teams, that's just what I do. I take a bit of paper and I divide it in half, and Bayern would be red, Dortmund would be in black, and I simply just start scribbling. I go through news stories, I refresh my memory with regard to the last time I did those teams and that game, which obviously is one of the biggest games in German football, arguably the biggest now, and just keep on going with that. But a lot of it is repetitive because I sort of live in this German world, even though I reside here in the USA. I'm an early riser, as you can confirm from the time of our interview here. I'm actually a very early riser, often up at sort of 4:35 in the morning. And I think part of that is to sort of be on German time. So I quite like getting up in the morning, having a look at the German newspapers, listening to the radio stations I listen to in Germany, scribbling a few things from there. So it's sort of all part of the same routine. But yeah, to get back to the preparation, it's just ongoing. And then what I tend to find is I do everything on an old-fashioned sheet of A4 paper. And this is because I began in Aberdeen in very cramped press boxes with no elbow room, and I had to have it all down in one bit of paper. So I've really sort of remained true to that method of preparation to this day. But what I find is that the last little bit of scribbling is always on the morning of the game. And usually by the time the game comes around, the sheet is complete. There's no space left on the sheet, and that's usually a sign to me that I've timed everything nicely. It's all there, and really the goal is to have it all implanted in the brain by the time kickoff comes around. I rarely look at the sheet itself during the match. It's a bit like studying for an exam, and this is my technique for being ready for exam time, which is kickoff time.
Well, for anybody watching this on YouTube, I mean, this is the fresh face of a man that was on at 6:30 to talk to us today. Very, very impressive. You can tell this is not a 6:30 face going on.
No, looks okay to me, Michael. Looks fine to me.
The detail in the preparation is amazing. I think what also stands out is the voice is instantly recognizable, and voices are such an interesting thing. I mean, my first love is radio, and you know those voices that you grew up hearing on the radio, but football commentators have that sort of power as well. You must at times have people awkwardly trying to figure out where they know you from, or going, "Yeah, are you the guy that does the match that the channel I watch?"
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think you're right, by the way, about voices. I think that if you go down the list of the commentators who anybody looks up to, you can picture that voice and you could pick that voice out a mile away. And it was something a producer said to me many years ago when I was in my younger days, an old Scottish producer who'd worked at the sharp end of UK broadcasting for a long time. And he wasn't prone to handing out too many compliments. But in his gruff way, he said to me, I'll say one thing for you. He said, you've got a very distinctive voice. He goes, don't lose that. He said, people will recognize your voice. He said, that's a good thing. And I think that is the case. I think that, and I say this to young broadcasters all the time who want to get into the commentary world, be yourself. There are structures within which you have to work, but always be yourself and make it your own voice and your own sound, and you won't go far wrong from that. Don't try to be an impersonator of somebody else. You can take the good things from somebody else's style. It's like a golfer. I always think you can look at a really good golfer. Don't try to copy his swing. You can learn from a good swing, but don't try to copy it. Make it your own. It used to happen to me a lot when I was, especially in Scotland, because you know what Scottish football is like. It's very popular as a sport, and especially in Glasgow, especially with Celtic and Rangers, where people have their preferences. And I would always find, in Glasgow, going to an airport check-in, going to buy a train ticket, even just at the security queue at Glasgow Airport all the time, you would have people saying, "Oh, I know your voice. I was listening to you earlier on. You're that guy on BT Sport, aren't you?" So all that sort of stuff. But yeah,
do you immediately die, or do you like it a little bit?
I have to admit, having lived in America for a long time prior to working in Scotland, back home in Scotland, obviously, and in America, you sort of get lost here because the sport is obviously growing, but it doesn't have the same resonance that it has in a place like Scotland. So I bet for a while it was quite nice, people actually recognizing your work. But yeah, there are times, and anybody will tell you this, in the Goldfish Bowl of Glasgow, there are times when you maybe do want to hide, depending on the day and depending on who's beaten whom and all that sort of stuff. But I have to say, most people were very nice and just enjoyed a little bit of chat about the game. And I miss that, to be honest, because, as I say, I've been back living here in the USA for 3 years. And here it's, as I say, the sport is on the way up, no doubt about that. But you can hide much more easily in this country.
Pros and cons then. As you've already said, you're not getting to travel nearly as much. You're not really traveling at all at the minute with everything that's going on in the world. And that must be a really strange experience for someone who I imagine has been on plenty of planes, been up and down many motorways in his life, to all of a sudden have a lot of time in one place.
It's been a big transition, yes, no doubt about that. And I'll be honest, at the start of this pandemic, while obviously we were not happy, nobody was happy to be in a pandemic situation, but that was the reality, that remains the reality. There was part of me that, again, I was trying to look sort of on the positive side of things. There was part of me that quite enjoyed the solitude and the being home, because big part of my job is on the road all the time, as you said, planes, trains, automobiles, rarely home. And I sort of thought, well, okay, I'm going to cherish the time that I have at home, because who knows, how long this is going to be? Who knows what the future holds with regard to any of this? So I actually found myself in a decent frame of mind from that point of view. I sort of thought, okay, well, we have to adjust to the reality. Obviously now several months into the pandemic and I haven't traveled, and I'm not going to be traveling, certainly not anywhere far, certainly not on a plane to Europe anytime in the near future. It's frustrating because it is what I do. It's what I love to do. But I also recognize that there's such a thing as the greater good. And if we all just selfishly said, well, it doesn't matter that there's a pandemic, we'll just go and do what we want to do, then, I think we'd be looking at real chaos as opposed to, what we have at the moment, which is frustration. So that's where we are with regard to this. There are creative ways through which we can work during a pandemic. And we set up a little mini studio here during the summer for me to take part in a fairly, how can I say it? I think you probably know what I'm talking about, but a project that I am associated with and continue to be associated with, and that'll probably come out quite soon. So having that gave me something to really work on and get my teeth into. And there is talk about doing more from my little studio just on the other side of that wall in the next few weeks and months. So we'll wait and see. And, I have a feeling we're going to be in this pandemic situation for a while. But to use that old expression, necessity is the mother of invention. And it's up to all of us to be inventive, to be creative, and to find our own ways of doing what we enjoy in the pandemic.
Yeah, I hope those walls are soundproof now. You wouldn't want to be interrupting anyone's television viewing.
Well, it's funny, for the project that I mentioned during the summer, it was often an all-day project, and we had a lot of laughs about it because there were times when, the sound of a lawnmower would be audible, or, a very loud lorry would go thundering past, or, literally thunder and lightning, or planes overhead once planes started to hit the air again. So things like that. But all part of the challenge.
I know it's a wonderful time to, as you say, to be creative and to try and reinvent ways of doing things. And to be fair to a lot of broadcast organizations, they've managed it, and I'm sure if supporters, viewers saw what was holding their programming together at times, they would be probably terrified, let alone, in amazement.
Yeah, I was talking to a very senior television producer just the other day about this, and he was saying that in time, we will look back and say that the pandemic did actually help us with our creativity, because we wouldn't have had the courage to try some of the things that we've been compelled to try, but for the circumstances, these very unusual circumstances. And that means technology, that means also just style of how we do things. I mean, you and I are talking here on a link that we may have used before, but now it's just become sort of de rigueur. It's every day that you jump onto a link like this and you talk to somebody, and it's as though we're in the same studio talking to each other. And so I think there are many ways through which we can do our jobs. There are still areas where we can't. I mentioned to you earlier on, I can't travel, and obviously as a commentator that means it's not quite as good. But to be honest, it's the way 90% of broadcasters are working nowadays. You simply cannot be at the event. There are some who can, if they're residents in a particular country, if they're the rights holding broadcaster in that country, yeah, they can be there. But for most of us now, it's off tube, and it's going to be off tube for a while.
I'm fascinated to know where your affinity with the German language and German football came from. It isn't necessarily an obvious connection from the outside looking in.
No, I'm glad you've asked me that question. It goes back to my days in Aberdeen. And I have to tell you that I was very happy to be in the class at my school that got German and not French. Because what happened was, it was sort of a down the middle situation. We started learning languages when we were around 10 in our primary school. And there were two classes in my year at school. One class got French, the other got German. I was in the German class, just by chance. Now, 1974 was when the seed was planted, because that was the West Germany World Cup. I watched every game. I was a 7-year-old at the time. I was obsessed with it. I was asking my dad and my mother all sorts of questions about German geography and history. And so I'd sort of said, I really would love to learn German, and, got my wish just because of the nature of how the classes were divided. And then when I went to secondary school, Hazelhead Academy in Aberdeen, I had a German teacher called Brian Steele, who I think realized from the word go that I was going to be a good student of his, because I was so keen. I really loved it, and it seemed to come quite naturally to me. And he was a great help. And, he went above and beyond in encouraging, what he clearly saw as a passion of mine. And then the other thing, and I don't know if it works this way, people probably don't operate this way in Northern Ireland nowadays, but in Scotland and Aberdeen, I was able to do this. Because of where Aberdeen is, if you can imagine, on the North Sea, right on the coast. And, if you were to take a boat and, go along the North Sea, you'd eventually come to the city of Hamburg. And because of this sort of sea link between Aberdeen and Hamburg, no land in between, we had access in Aberdeen to NDR, which is Norddeutscher Rundfunk, North German Radio. And, I discovered this as I was a bit of a radio enthusiast as a youngster, as I suspect you probably were too. And so I used to just, tune around these old-fashioned radios. You could, fine-tune the dial, and I found you could get Hamburg. You could also get the Netherlands. You could get Hilversum from the Netherlands. A bit more trouble getting Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, interestingly enough, because of where we were. We could get Germany and the Netherlands much more easily. So I began to make this...
for us quicker, Derek.
No problems. I think you'd have had trouble understanding our Aberdeen accents. I think that might have been the issue. But I realized that I could listen to German radio and did it every night. And this, of course, was way back in the late 70s, early 80s. No internet, years away from having internet. So this was a window into Germany for me. And I used to do it nightly. I would sit and listen, and it was a mix of music and talk and news and sport. And I realized that when the Bundesliga was on, I could listen to the Bundesliga, the Konferenzschaltung, as they called it, which was this wonderfully revolutionary setup whereby all the games would be happening at the same time, and they would just bounce from game to game to game to game to game. And, as a fledgling German student, this was just nirvana, because I got to combine my love of language with my love of football. And, at that time, I could have told you everything that had happened in the German league matches without having watched any of it, because you couldn't watch it, but I could listen to all of it. And, the pictures were so vivid in my mind, and my German got better and better, obviously, through that. So that's really where it all started. And, when I say to people, once it's part of you, it doesn't leave you, it has never left me. And, at different phases of my broadcasting career, I've covered different leagues. And it's really only in the last sort of decade I've been able to turn my attention to the Bundesliga on a much wider basis. I always followed it, and I always, bought my magazines from Germany, my Kicker and my Sportbild, and listened to the radio and watch it on TV, obviously, in more recent years. But that's how it all began.
It's amazing. I mean, to be your family at that time, I wonder what they were thought. Derek's locked away in his room. He's got his radio set to Hamburg's radio station. This is, where is this going to lead to? Little did they know.
Well, I'm sure, yeah. And I had a very bad habit, actually, of falling asleep with the radio on. So occasionally I'd be told off the next morning that, nobody could sleep because they heard German voices all night, because I'd have the radio locked on to NDR. But yeah, nobody could have imagined that. As I say, I didn't think when I was studying German that it was necessarily going to lead to anything with broadcasting. I actually thought that that's probably what I would end up doing, would be something more in the German language field, a teacher, a translator, interpreter, something of that nature. But I've found that it really has been a huge advantage for me, because here I am now with the Bundesliga as the main league that I cover, and it undoubtedly gives you an advantage. I mean, you can read things before other people can read them. And okay, I know there are things like Google Translate nowadays, which is a great tool, but you're never going to really understand the sort of essence of a country until you know that language yourself, until you can actually read something without having to go through a crude translation that often misses the point of what's actually being said.
And that allows you to immediately tap into the feeling as well in and around the stories that are being reported, rather than understanding or interpreting a translation which is already slightly off. It's an interesting...
I think that's right, yeah. And I always say to young people, say, what can I do if I really want to cover international football as opposed to the domestic game? I will say, learn the language. If you're interested in French football, go and learn French. Italian football, learn Italian. La Liga, Spanish, whatever your preference is, go and learn a couple of languages if you can, because I think we are moving more and more into that world. And yes, people like to speak English. There's no doubt about that. But, give yourself that advantage.
Yeah, I won't embarrass myself with my Gommel German knowledge. My 1 year of German's very long in the past, Derek. So,
no, but it would be 1 year more than a lot of people, Michael. So, yeah, and it's never too late to keep expanding upon it.
Very true. No, it's an interesting thing, and the nuance of any language as well. And you start to pick up the dialects and how that even shifts. I imagine those early days when you were being a bit braver and starting to speak German to German speakers, you're finding that out for yourself.
Yeah, 100%. I remember in the early days, I was quite nervous about speaking it, but I really forced myself to do it in first trips to Germany. And then when I first went to Switzerland, that was a real eye-opener, because if anybody knows anything about Switzerland, yes, it's a multilingual country, and one of the languages, the main language actually, is German. But it's German with a big, big difference. And I often liken it to, really broad northeast Aberdonian Scots. It's a bit, if you were to go into the countryside in the northeast of Scotland and you heard, allegedly English being spoken, we call it the Doric. It's a sort of a language all of its own there. And that's really what Swiss German is like. It's almost unintelligible to a high German speaker. And I remember being very frustrated the first time I went to Switzerland, so much so that, and I actually have the book on my shelf behind where I'm talking to you from now. I bought a book of Swiss German to basically instill that in me. And once I got the basics of that, I realized it's actually not as far away from high German as you might think. In some cases it is. But once you learn some of the rudiments of it, then you could get with it. And I'm at the point now where I can go to Switzerland and actually speak in Swiss German, at least my version of Swiss German, and feel a bit more part of the scene.
Love that. It gives a great indication of your character as well. If there's a bee in your bonnet, you're going to pursue it, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm a bit like that. Yeah, I'm a little bit of a pedant when it comes to trying to be 100% right, trying to be as accurate as I can. And yeah, that's just the way I am. When I'm really into something, then I go 100% in.
Some people watching this will know you, especially for your work with the FIFA games.
Yes.
Did you know what you were getting yourself into in terms of how big an audience that is? Because it's not necessarily the same audiences you would have had for television viewing.
I think I knew a little. I don't think I knew the whole enchilada, so to speak, about how big FIFA was. I mean, obviously I was aware of the game and how iconic it was, but when they approached me, and then when we agreed that I would be part of, to begin with, FIFA 19, they made it clear that, my life would probably change quite a lot, that the attention on things like social media would be much bigger, the scrutiny would be much bigger, and, it would mean a lot of new viewers, if you like, new listeners, people who maybe are not necessarily fans of watching football on TV, hugely into this iconic game. And yeah, they let it be known when they're not happy about something. And that goes with the territory. But to be honest, I was just hugely honored to be asked, because they could have asked any commentator in world football. And the fact that they came to me, I thought, wow, this really, is going to take a while to sink in. But again, I go about it with so much enthusiasm. I have a smile on my face every day when I enter the studio. I have a smile on my face when I leave the studio. It's all about teamwork with FIFA. It's a very small team that I personally work with, an audio producer, a sound man, and then a creative team supporting. And we're all in it together, and we all help each other. And, there are things that occasionally go wrong. Obviously, Lee Dixon is my co-com, and we have a lot of great laughs putting it all together when occasionally things go wrong, don't quite happen as we wanted them to happen when we visualize the particular scene in our minds. But it is just a fabulous experience, and I consider myself very privileged to be part of it.
That is a real skill, to be able to commentate on those games in the way that you do. I don't know if people probably don't even consider what goes into it, to be honest, because as a commentator, and I'm not explaining this to you, but just for anyone that's never sat in a commentary box and had that responsibility, you're reacting to live pictures as they happen. And there's one thing putting words and emotion into a real moment. There's another thing imagining it, conjuring it up, and having to sort of do it 7 or 8 or 9, or maybe far more probably, different ways.
Yeah, and that is the skill that you have to have for FIFA is, when I'm doing the FIFA commentary, I am not watching a game that you're playing or anybody else is playing. I'm simply trying to, go into my brain and into my soul as well, if you like, and find a line that is fitting of that particular moment. And yeah, it could be 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 different versions of that same thing. And so we try to vary it during the day so that it's not repetitive and we're doing different things. A lot of it, of course, comes down to names, and names with different inflections. And as you can imagine, if you're doing too much that's too high all at once, that's not great for the voice. So there's a balance. And as I said, I'm blessed to work with a great team of people who know the business so well, know the game so well, and I think know me very well now too. So they know how best to get the best out of me at any particular time of a day. So sometimes we start with, more low intensity things and we build up and then we go back down again. And it's just all about making the day as productive as possible.
For any budding broadcasters watching, it'd be remiss of me not to tap into your wealth of knowledge and experience. What are your do's and don'ts for aspiring or fledgling commentators?
Well, I think the do's are get practical experience. You can never have any shortage of that. And, that means being a bit of a self-starter. So, obviously things are limited right now during the pandemic, but, make a tape of yourself watching a game on your own screen and listen back and be critical, and then make another tape. And then eventually, when the time is right, when it's safe, go out and do that at a game. It could be an amateur game. It could be anything. It doesn't have to be a big crowd. It's just all about building your skill level. And you can't do that enough. So practical experience, go out there and do it. That would be the main thing. Believe in yourself. Strike a balance between pestering people too much and not enough. People always say, well, should I just call somebody every week? No, don't do that. Time it right, build a relationship with somebody who's in a position maybe to employ you down the line, and just keep in touch. And there's a way of doing that. That's a skill in itself. The don'ts, I would say, are don't follow the crowd. And when I say that, I mean be your own broadcaster, have your own style, listen to other broadcasters, yes, in terms of broadcasters you respect. What are they doing that you really like, and how can you maybe adopt that technique, but don't try to impersonate, if that makes sense. But be your own person. And that also extends to being disciplined, because a big part of the job is the voice. And I can't tell you the number of times I've had to turn down invitations to people's homes, to parties, to dinners, the night before a game, the week of a game, because I have a game the next day, or I have 4 games in 5 days. And the last thing that you want to do is to be abusing the voice with loud music playing. Even to this day, if there's loud music in a restaurant, I'm going in a different direction. I'm going where it's quiet and there's no background noise. And people think that's crazy. But as I always say, this is the musical instrument when it comes to the job. So that's what I say to young broadcasters. Realize that you have to protect the voice. You have to almost treat it as though you are a singer. And I've spoken to singers about this. They are exactly the same with their voices. And they won't abuse their voices. They won't do anything silly like that. So think about it in those terms. Be really dedicated, but have fun when you're on the air as well, because that's going to come through too. And if you do those things and you don't do those things that I mentioned as well, then I think you won't go far wrong.
I mean, the early lesson I had to teach myself when I was translating from radio to television was just to shut up a bit more, to be totally honest.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. As a commentator, and this is where the skill sets are, I will say, radio and television, they're like cousins rather than siblings. Because yes, there are things that they have in common, but on TV, you will never be criticized on TV for saying too little, or at least rarely. You will be criticized for talking too much. And people often learn that the hard way. And if you simply go into a TV commentary using the same techniques that you need for radio, which are descriptive and are non-stop and are basically being the eyes of the listener, if you do that on TV, you will quickly get people annoyed. So I always say, start with basic TV commentary. And basic TV commentary is identification. That is the main body of what we do. If we do nothing else, we must identify. Identify who's on the ball, identify who took the shot. Sometimes, and if you go back to very old commentaries, if you listen to my early commentaries from the 1980s, they would sound very sparse. because back then we were encouraged just to really identify and do little else, and always provide an edit point. We were always told, provide an edit point so that we can cut neatly from one to another. And that actually forced discipline upon commentators. It made us be very conscious of how we were talking in a fairly sort of clipped, structured way, so that that edit point could be made and it would sound seamless. Nowadays, on live TV commentaries, you will hear a lot more in the way of chatter between commentator and co-commentator. And I always think that, there comes a point where we need to maybe be careful about that, because the viewer can see what's going on for himself or herself. It's our job as commentators on TV to add to the picture rather than to just talk for the sake of talking.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and it's an interesting difference or a balance that you must strike there. But what a wonderful thing to call work all the same.
Oh, yeah. I mean, listen, I thank my lucky stars every day that I get to do what I enjoy, because so many people don't. And, we all have bad days, even in jobs that we enjoy, like this one, we have bad days. But you've got to remind yourself that, I'm doing what so many people would love to be doing. When you tell them what you do and you work in football as a commentator, they go, oh, that sounds like the dream job. And and I say, well, yeah, dream job, but of course it's a job, and we get frustrated with certain things as well, and things don't always go our way. But very, very fortunate. No two ways about that.
And one of the amazing things about your career is the breadth of competitions that you have been a part of and been able to voice. Working at a World Cup, working at numerous World Cups, must rank quite highly up there, if that isn't too presumptuous of me to say.
I've been very fortunate, Michael. I've been involved in every World Cup since 1990 in one capacity or another, actually, and a couple of them as an organizer for the World Cup Organizing Committee in the USA in 94, and for FIFA, actually, in 2002 as a media organizer. But for the other ones as a broadcaster at the World Cups. And it is an amazing time. And you don't sleep very much. You just go through this mad few weeks where you've hopefully done most of your preparation before you even arrive at the venues. And then it's just a sort of a dash from one place to another. It's all a bit of a blur, to be honest, but you're working with a team normally. And that's the most rewarding part of it, is collaborating with this small team, a producer, maybe an assistant producer, co-commentator, sound person, and you all travel together and you sort of just throw everything into it. And the one thing that might surprise people about World Cups is, as a broadcaster there, you actually miss quite a lot of the action because you're traveling. So that, you might have the middle game of the day if there are 3 games, and you don't see the first game because your mind is very much on what you're doing with regard to your game, and you don't see the last game because you're then traveling to go somewhere else. And so the big challenge is catching up now when you are on the road during the World Cup. It's easier these days because the broadcasters who you work for will all have, tapes, not so much tapes, but links to games that you might have missed. But I remember in my early days, that was the big challenge, was traveling all the time and having to say to the producer, well, I'm not sure how much I can say about the game last night because I didn't see it.
So, in terms of highlights from your career then, what would you say are some of the moments you will cherish? Because the thing I think all commentators, any good commentator I've ever met has, is just this incredible memory of things. That it stays vivid, and there's something about football in general that I'm sure supporters are the same. There are certain goals or certain games that they could recite maybe better than birthdays or maybe weddings.
Yeah, I mean, the one that stands out for me and that will always stand out because I was just darned lucky to be there. 2005 in Istanbul, when Liverpool came from 3-0 down to draw 3-3 with Milan, extra time, and then win the Champions League on penalties. And, we'd made the long journey from the US. It was 3-0 to Milan at half-time. I was looking at my notes, just making sure I had in my mind what the biggest margin of victory was in a European final up to that point, because I thought there was going to be an absolute hammering in the second half. And Liverpool produced the comeback of all comebacks. Now, as a commentator, to be there and to be able to put words to that story, it just doesn't get any better than that. And I said that to my co-commentator after the game. I said, we will look back on this forever. and just thank the football gods that we got the chance to be here and to broadcast this. And I've always said that I don't think that will be topped in my lifetime. I'll be surprised if it is ever topped as a spectacle in a major final for that scenario to unfold. But it did. And we were there, and, hopefully the words did the occasion justice. So that would obviously stand out. In Germany, as recently as 3 years ago, Dortmund Schalke, the mother of all derbies, as they call it, 4-0 to Dortmund at halftime, 4-4 at the end of the game, with Schalke equalising with virtually the last kick through Naldo. Again, to be part of that, again, special for me, because that is the biggest derby in Germany, and every game sort of is like a new chapter in the story of that derby. And to have been the commentator at the microphone for what will go down as probably the most dramatic German derby of all time for the world feed that day, again, that will stay with me forever. And then there were a few moments in Scotland when I was working there again in my second spell, and probably the one that stands out was a Hearts-Hibs derby. Hearts were about to go down. Everybody sort of knew that. But there was the chance, if they lost to Hibs in the derby, and it's my favourite Scottish derby, the Edinburgh derby, if they lost to Hibs, then they'd be relegated by their eternal rivals on their own patch. And obviously everybody wanted to avoid that at Heart of Midlothian. And they did. And they summoned the courage to produce the sort of performance they hadn't been producing all season. They were in all sorts of financial trouble at the time. And I was very proud of the commentary that day. And I was proud of the fact that a lot of Hearts fans came up to me afterwards or contacted me on social media and said, your words really summed up the way we were feeling that day. And I'm not a Hearts fan, I'm not a Hibs fan, I'm just a neutral observer and a lover of that particular derby. And as it turned out, Hibs actually went down with them that same season as a result of losing in a playoff to Hamilton Accies. So that story, that derby story, is up there with the best of my memories.
And we started talking about the Bundesliga at the beginning. I want to close on that because obviously with so many eyes on it, Premier League clubs have swooped in for some star players. Kai Havertz, of course, is signed for Chelsea. Timo Werner is gone as well. There's speculation about Upamecano, RB Leipzig. There's a wealth of players. Obviously, Jadon Sancho is being discussed as well. I'm sure it's no surprise to you to see the guys make that move. Part one of the question, I think, is, do you think that the players that have come into the Premier League or are about to start their new Premier League careers will hit the ground running? And the second part is, do you expect more players to maybe be coming before the end of this window? Manchester United fans leaning forwards now.
Well, I think the first part of the question there, will they hit the ground running? I believe they will. If we're talking about Havertz and Werner, I think that they are ready for this. I think they've been mentally ready for this for a while. We didn't necessarily know it was going to be Chelsea. I think maybe the Corona situation has influenced that decision, and Chelsea are in a position to make those signings in a way that maybe other leading clubs around Europe aren't. But having watched a lot of both of them, I think Werner is a greatly mature player now in a way he wasn't a couple of years ago. I think his all-around game is a lot better. He's more than just a pacey counter-attacking forward. He can play in a number of positions across the front. Kai Havertz, been watching him since his debut, and he had a bit of a sticky patch at the beginning of last season by his own high standards. That's really the only difficult spell he's had in his career so far. Again, I think he's ready for this, and I'll be surprised if he doesn't hit the ground running. Is this a trend? Second part of your question. I think, unfortunately, it probably is. It has been a little bit for a while. I mean, Bundesliga clubs have been quite canny, really, in terms of how they've dealt with their players. And when there is an offer from an English club, it's often said in Germany there's a price for a player, and then there's a Premier League price for that same player. And, it goes up when there's interest from the Premier League. And that will continue to be the case. And with that in mind, it'll continue to be the best selling option with regard to Bundesliga clubs. And I think the more we see German players, specifically like Havertz and Werner in the Premier League, the more we will see other German players. But of course, the Bundesliga is not just about German players too. And, we'll see to what extent it extends to other players during this transfer window. I'm not sure it'll be that many more in this transfer window. I know there has been talk about Dayo Upamecano. The signals I'm getting from Leipzig are that they might not really be inclined to sell in this particular window. But I think, yeah, it will be something that we ought to watch for in the years ahead.
And Sancho, if you had to call it?
If I had to call it, I think he stays at Borussia Dortmund for one more season.
Oh, there you go. It's an interesting time. Certainly people will be watching it. And the other side of the story, of course, too, is players using the Bundesliga now, British players getting into the Bundesliga and I guess spreading their wings a bit more than traditionally they would have done.
Yeah, well, I think Jadon Sancho was a big influence on that front, and certainly Jude Bellingham, who Dortmund have signed as well from Birmingham. I think, you know, he has gone on record as saying that what Sancho has done with Dortmund has opened his eyes, and I think it'll be that way for other British players, and it really should be that way because it's a big football world out there. I've always said it's the one thing that I think holds British players back is the fact that they are in their comfort zone. It's easy to say, well, you know, I'll make the championship in England my goal, and you can have a very good career in the championship in England. You can make a lot of money, but life is about more than money. It's also about that life experience. And I always look at Scandinavian players, you know, not so very far from British shores. And I often think when I talk to them, when I'm lucky enough to talk to some of them, they seem a lot more rounded as people. And I think a lot of that is having had exposure to other countries from a young age, speaking other languages. And the Bundesliga has been instrumental in that. And of course, every Bundesliga dressing room has multiple languages, and often the default language is English. But if you can broaden your horizons, you know, I think it makes you a better human being. And I think, you know, logically, it makes you a better footballer as well.
There you go. Do you know what? That is a lovely message to finish on. A ray of positivity there, Derek. No pun intended.
No, well, thank you for that. Yeah, we can make it an RAE of positivity to end. Thank you for the chat, Michael. Really enjoyed it.
Loved having you on the score. Thank you very much, Derek Rae.
Anytime.